Okay, thanks, Philippe, for the introduction. Thanks, Franco, also. Welcome, everyone, and I'm very glad to share this space with you all. Actually, I don't know, but I would prefer if everyone would turn their cameras on. Like, not their microphones, just their cameras. So that we can see each other while we're talking and not just a screen with little squares and names on it. The first question we proposed ourselves to answer in this conversation is like what the COVID pandemic has taught us about the state of the world, and if there are links to other crises between the ecological and the socio-economic and inequality, etc. So maybe I would start saying that I think the COVID crisis has taught us a lot about our abilities or not to cope with problems of global dimensions, like the pandemic is one. And it has taught us that summing up a lot of national strategies which differ very much from each other are very, very different from adopting one jointly constructed, democratically built global strategy. In the COVID pandemic, I would say that clearly private and national interests have prevailed. It has not worked to overcome them in order to distribute patents to produce vaccines throughout the world, for example. The inequalities, all the existing inequalities have kicked in very hard, but especially the abilities or margins of action of different countries and regions to cope with this pandemic have shown very asymmetric. So the outcome was that some lives have definitely been much more important than other lives in the solutions that human societies have found to the pandemic up to now. And also we have learned that the international institutional framework that we have given ourselves is not really fit for democratic global governance. Rather, it seems that there is a very tight corridor of what is thinkable or proposable as a solution to the different crises. And I'm going to get to that right now. It's like if those in charge and the main institutions would ask themselves the question, what can we change in what we have so that nothing really changes? How can we absolutely move around the measures that we take around saving economic growth, saving the capitalist economy, regaining the dynamic of economic growth? It seems that has been the main concern, and not sustaining life, saving lives in the pandemic. And so this brings me to my second point. I think that we do not only have a multidimensional crisis, which is obviously ecological, and also the pandemic is an ecological problem at its roots because it's related to the destruction of biodiversity, ecosystems where wildlife lives, the expansion of the agro-industrial food system that we have given ourselves. It is also economic, financial, political. We see like a loss of credibility of our decision-making mechanisms, of electoral politics, liberal politics all over the world. It is a crisis of migration, of inequality, of militarization, which is ever increasing. And I think it is very important to understand all these aspects of this crisis as systemic, like interlinked, interconnected, one with the other, and not to address them like separately. And together with many Latin American activists and intellectuals, I would also say this is a crisis which does not only threaten our current dominant civilization, the modern capitalist colonial at the same time, but it's also rooted in some assumptions of this civilization, which makes it a civilizational crisis indeed, because it has some of its roots in the modern Western liberal truth regime. Like, for what do we produce knowledge, and how do we produce knowledge, and how do we expect this specific kind of knowledge to solve the problems that we face? And here I would mention three. One is the hierarchic separation from culture and nature, from humans and non-human beings, from subject and object in general in our way of knowing, and creating these hierarchized dichotomies which have placed humans above all the rest. And also the driver for knowing, the will to know in modern science, has been associated very strongly, and this is maybe especially true in all the life sciences that come to the front today, with the will to control, to dominate, and to transform. So maybe we have to ask ourselves in these academic university settings, what for do we really want to know? What is the purpose of knowing? Is it controlling, or is it sustaining life? And this is closely linked to a instrumental rationality, which in my perspective is condensed somehow in this, what I said before, the imperative of economic growth and accumulation, which has become like the center of social organization, but not only of social and economic organization, but also of our culture, maybe of our imaginaries of how do we conceive success. How do we conceive our own lives in biographical terms? There is also this underlying, always this paradigm of expansion underlying. We have to always get better, always learn, always improve, always expand what we can and what we have and what we have access to. So I think in this general picture, the challenge that we face is that if we have a systemic and a civilizational crisis, we have to find solutions that also are systemic, that build up another system, and not just get some of the superficial symptoms that we can identify. And we also have to rethink our place in the world, like more in an epistemic and even ontological way, like what is the purpose of humans in this world? Thanks for now. I hope this introduction hasn't been too lengthy and you can pick it up now, Ashish.
Thanks, thanks, Miriam. No, that was, I mean, I think you brought up a whole lot of very crucial points, important points. I'll try not to repeat any of them. There will, of course, be some overlap. So I'll maybe picking up on your last point here. I think one of the things that the COVID pandemic has also taught us is, or should be teaching us, is the need for some humility of the place of humans on Earth. If a tiny virus could bring us to our knees, we need to understand that the rest of nature also has agency. It has a power of its own, which of course indigenous peoples have recognized for thousands of years. But as modern human beings, we seem to imagine that we can conquer and rule over the rest of the earth. And as we have seen with this crisis, that is just simply not the case. If something that we can't even see is able to make our systems collapse so badly, then Jamaican, okay. It's surely something that we should learn from. The other thing which also relates to what you said is, I think one of the biggest lessons we've seen, and certainly this is true in India, but I guess all across the world, is the sort of incredible vulnerability of hundreds of millions of people, or maybe at least 2 or 3 billion people, to collapse, to economic collapse. And this is directly related to a system of economic globalization, which has made us dependent for our basic needs, like livelihoods or food or water or energy, on production systems or people or organizations very far away. And so when something like that collapses, when the systems of communication fail, or when you can't actually have global trade anymore, or even national level trade anymore, then there's a fundamental then basically the livelihoods we're dependent on, or the basic needs we're getting from elsewhere, are also seriously threatened. And we saw in India the absolutely shocking, I don't know where this sound is coming from. Anyway, we saw in India the absolutely shocking images of thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, of workers, having to actually walk back to their villages when the Prime Minister announced a sudden economic lockdown. The migrant workers, casual labor, all of these. I mean, and 93% of India's workforce is actually in the informal or unorganized sector, which means that they actually simply do not have economic security of any kind to fall back on when something like this happens. So it brings a very serious question mark to the policies of economic globalization, which are global institutions like IMF and World Bank and others have been pushing for the last few decades. What could be the alternative to that is something we can come back to a bit later. I think the third thing is that it's not just the economic system, it's also ecological devastation that has created enormous vulnerability amongst people. If they no longer have their coastal areas, their waters, their forests, their grasslands, and their agricultural lands to fall back on because they have been devastated, their ecologies have been devastated for various reasons, then they have to be dependent on the external economy that much more. And that itself makes them extremely vulnerable. This is apart from what you said about how the ecological devastation causes imbalances of the kind that even pushes zoonotic diseases and other things into our lives. And finally, I think one of the crucial lessons is that the nation state, by and large, and corporations, by and large, I think the biggest lesson is that they don't learn the lessons, or they don't want to learn the lessons. Because this is not the first crisis. No, we've gone through a number of crises before that. There are local, global, national crises of all kinds. But they don't want to learn the lesson. They just simply do not want to learn the lessons from these crises. And therefore, I think it's all the more obvious in the last 2 years that we just cannot depend on the nation state and or on corporations to be able to bail us out of things like this and to be able to lead us to some kind of justice and sustainability. And so therefore, exactly what you said, we have to look for and search for and support systemic fundamental alternatives which make us much less dependent on, and which actually challenge the fundamental power of the corporations. Organizers, can you maybe just remove this person, because there doesn't seem to be a control. Philippe, I think you could just remove. It's extremely disturbing.
Yes, I'll do that.
Thank you. So yeah, I think therefore the need for systemic changes, which you highlighted, Miriam, and we can come back to that in maybe the later questions. So should we go to the second question then, which is what kind of, as against what we're, the kind of problems that we're talking about, what are the, the more hopeful, more inspirational kind of responses that we have seen from communities around the world?
What is everyone doing today?
Would you like to go on that first, or should I go?
No, go ahead, Ashish. Let's switch. Who goes first? I think that's fine.
All right. Yeah. So I think, I mean, as against the kind of increasing authoritarian tendencies of the nation state and the, I don't know how many $1 trillion more profits that corporations have made in the last 1.5 to 2 years using this opportunity. As against that, what we're seeing in local communities, both rural and urban, are some absolutely incredible experiences and examples of resilience in the face of the COVID pandemic and the economic lockdowns. Stories of solidarity, stories of how young people have gone out of their comfort zones to help the elderly, whether it's to do with health or it's to do with simply bringing food and medicines where they were locked up, and many other such examples. And I think, I mean, I can give you maybe a couple of stories just to quickly illustrate this. In South India, 5,000 women farmers belonging to the Dalits, which is the so-called untouchables or the most marginalized section of Indian society, they, over the last 20-25 years, having achieved a level of food security and food sovereignty, in fact, complete control over everything to do with food, where during the entire COVID period, secure not just with food, because they have their own local food systems, organic, local seeds, etc., but also that they were contributing to the food relief efforts of the district administration, and had also very little, if any, health problems during this whole pandemic period. Second example is from Central India of indigenous people who, having achieved, having reclaimed their collective rights to forests around them, were able to generate resources from those forests over the last few years, which went into a common kitty or a common fund, which was then used for helping those migrant labor who had gone away from their villages earlier and then had to come back during the COVID pandemic. So they didn't suffer any problems because there were community resources to fall back on. Over in your region, the Parque de la Papa Potato Park, the same thing, right? The Quechua indigenous people of the Andes Mountains were totally secure during this entire pandemic, and they were in fact providing food to people in Cusco town. So I think what this shows us is 3 or 4 really crucial parts of how a community is resilient and how it can kind of cope in this crisis. Number 1, solidarity. So systems of collective working, collective spirit, expressing, being able to be in solidarity with each other, where the most marginalized or vulnerable are helped by those who are a little bit more fortunate. Second, sustaining and having good custodianship over the commons, land, forests, water, coastal area, seas, whatever your commons are, and knowledge, crucially. Third, collective rights and responsibilities. So yes, asserting that we will be expressing self-determination over this area, we will be deciding what happens in this entire biocultural landscape, but we will also be responsible towards each other, towards the rest of nature, and others outside our system who are vulnerable and suffering. And fourth, sustaining, reviving, and enhancing the base of knowledge and the diversity of knowledge systems. Because what we saw again was that people were expressing their own local knowledge systems, their traditional knowledge, but also sometimes bringing in knowledge from outside and creating hybrid systems, which enabled this kind of resilience process to be much more strong. So these are some of the things I think we've seen in terms of community response. But over to you, Miriam.
Okay, thanks, Ashish. I think I would like to point out as a little footnote a relative disagreement with the concept or with the term, which is the term of resilience. I'm somehow skeptical if this term is so helpful in strategic ways, because in my understanding, it places the focus of the responsibility of dealing with this kind of crisis on local communities and expects from them that they have to gain the abilities to withstand the effects or the symptoms of this kind of crisis. And so you lose sight a bit of the causes, and maybe you don't place the responsibilities where they belong so much, like on the big polluters and the super rich. I understand that your way of putting forward resilience, Ashish, is making visible all those actions that communities do and that are made invisible normally in the dominant discourse. But I would like to bring that back in, that we still have to make accountable the people that are responsible for this crisis, and can't just shift the responsibilities, because there are different uses of the term resilience. And in the dominant climate discourse, for example, in climate adaptation discourse, it tends to be used, like I just said, like, okay, then we have to make some fixes so communities get more resilient and we can keep polluting and keep emitting CO2 and etc. Yeah. For the rest, I very much agree with what you just described. I think we have seen processes of more or less forced deglobalization during the last year, during the big shutdown especially, which have shown us the advantages of short supply chains, local food production. We have seen that there was a sort of inversion. Normally, urban life is always deemed more progressive and successful than rural life, which is usually seen as somehow backward, and, you know, peasants, they're seen as underdeveloped many times. And in the pandemic situation, there was an inversion of those approaches to valuation, we could say, as rural populations have come to help out urban populations. Here in Ecuador, we have had lots of examples where peasants came with truckloads of food just to give it out to the urban populations, which had lost their employments and their monetary income, and really to a significant proportion didn't know how to get through the month. At the same time, I think that we could point out that here in Latin America in the last years, we have had a very strong push of all kinds of feminist mobilizations, like popular feminisms, communitarian feminisms, decolonial feminisms, which have managed to link the concerns that women had in the cities to the other concerns that women had in their territories, which were being attacked by huge mega projects, dams or mining projects or other types of extractions, linking all those violences, the ones done to the bodies and the ones done to the territories, in a new perspective that the body is the first territory that we inhabit. And the feminists also have helped the whole discussion in Latin America, I would say, bringing intersectionality in, like linking the problems, as I said before, thinking about the interdependencies and the interconnectednesses in the analysis and also the solutions. They have proposed to put care to the front, not only intrahuman care, like not only care for the elders or care for the sick or care in the hospitals and for the COVID patients, but also care for nature, care for our surroundings, which we depend on. And so there is this other paradigm emerging, which is let's organize our societies around the concept of care. And then as a third point, maybe, which is important, is that we also see a series of other strategies just related to this caring for nature concept, which are court cases to protect concrete ecosystems from the ever-expanding extractivist appetites. Like just last week or 2 weeks ago, here in Ecuador, a court case has been won for the protection of a tropical forest against a mining project on the basis of the rights of nature. So as you know, maybe in Ecuador, the rights of nature are in the constitution since 2008, but implementing them has been rather a challenge. So this kind of jurisprudence is very important as it sets some precedents for other protected ecosystems Yeah, and yeah, maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Miriam. Maybe we can get to the third question, but before that, I think on the issue of resilience, that's a very important point you made.
On that.
The important point you made. I love going back to the origins of words, and resilience comes from the Latin resilere, which means jump back. And to me, actually, that's a very important part of this whole thing, because communities have been oppressed for a very long time by nation states and corporations. And they're actually jumping back. They're talking about, no, we are going to assert our rights to decision making. We're going to assert our autonomy over our land, our self-determination, etc. That's the resilience that I think is what is very crucial as a response to whether it's COVID or climate or any of the other crises. And I think we also need struggles for reclaiming and rescuing words and concepts. It's the same with democracy. I mean, democracy has been stolen by those who say that, oh, just come for elections, vote some political party into power, and then we'll do the rest. You sit back and relax and watch Netflix. Whereas what is democracy is, for instance, what the Central Indian indigenous people or the Sapara Nation in Ecuador or so many other indigenous nations and local communities are asserting is that no, democracy is power of the people, our power. We assert the power where we are, or what we in India call Swaraj or self-rule. So anyway, that was a sort of a comment on the comment on resilience. But I totally understand what you're saying and the way it's distorted and it's used as a means to basically say, well, no, you people stay resilient. We'll do whatever we want, but make sure that you can survive all the horrors that we are imposing on you, and that's a problem. Yeah. So the third question, I think, third question that we were thinking of was that it's not just in these 2 years, right, that that communities have been able to show the power that they have or show the knowledge systems and what they're capable of. And also for people, the best of human spirit to come out in terms of being able to be in solidarity with each other, help each other, like the examples that both of us gave. This is based on maybe decades or centuries of these kinds of so-called alternative initiatives, of initiatives which either sustain traditions that are still relevant, of working together with each other, working with the rest of nature, etc., or in new ways. In many of the industrialized countries and regions, also new ways by which people are expressing these kinds of initiatives. So one of the things maybe, and maybe you can go first on this, is that what are these existing alternatives or existing initiatives which are already showing us pathways, even well before the COVID pandemic?
Okay, great. Yeah, I see there are some comments about land rights in the chat, and I would like to react to that first. I think that it is a very, very crucial issue, at least from a Latin American perspective, like the priorities for tackling the environmental crisis here in Latin America are rather different than from those in Europe or the US, where energy transition is the most important thing, and switching of the whole tech base of the industries to renewables. Latin America's carbon emissions mainly come from agriculture and deforestation. And so there cannot be a substantive change to that if there is not agrarian reform and a reform of land rights and property rights. And there have been some interesting cases of recognizing collective lands, communitarian lands. And I think this is even more important than only talking about land rights, is talking about collective land rights, which are not commodifiable and put some barriers to speculation, because land alienation is also a very strong trend around here. So we have to put people in the condition to collectively decide how to use their land in order to regain like fundamental aspects like food sovereignty, for example. Lately, there are some examples where municipalities can recognize, can officialize collective land rights in the property register. So this is one way of doing that, which also works for non-indigenous populations, because usually collective land rights are only granted to indigenous populations. But I think we urgently need to get mestizo and non-indigenous peasants into the picture too, and also like small fisheries and land rights to the sea in some point. So there's a big discussion around that. In terms of available alternatives, I would like to point out first that there is a significant amount of theory production, of conceptual work around this from the Global South. I would like to stress that because especially in the academic discussion, the Global South usually tends to be used for case studies. Like, we do the theory and you provide the case to prove my theory. So I think we could switch perspectives and look at the theory production on alternatives around, for example, post-development, post-extractivism, alternatives to development, alternatives to growth, environmental justice, climate justice, the whole discussion about the pluriverse, Buen Vivir, of course, as an important strand emerging from Latin America, but also the whole debates about care economy or care ethics from the feminist perspective. So there is, I think that's a big basket. You can revise the book that Ashish mentioned at the beginning, or maybe Philippe mentioned in Ashish's presentation, the Pluriverse Dictionary, which addresses a lot of these concepts and also practical ways of implementing them. And I think the important thing about existing alternatives is that we have to understand that there is a machinery in place in dominant discourse to make them systematically invisible. As soon as you give yourself the purpose to see those alternatives, they emerge everywhere, yeah? Like people sharing certain parts of their, the reproduction of their lives through commoning, people organizing in different ways in order to begin to relate with each other again and counter individualization. There are, the thing is that normally there, like Boaventura de Sousa Santos says, there is this dispositive in place that says, okay, all those cases are only local, or they are only rural, or they are only done by poor people, and so they are systematically irrelevant. And yeah, it's not something we should care about, yeah? And so there is a necessary change of lens of perceiving the world, I think, in order to make these alternatives that are taking place in so many places of the world visible. I will talk about two discussions that might be interesting right now, because they try to give answers somehow to the multidimensional crisis from different perspectives. One is a declaration and process that has been launched last year in Latin America, which is called the Pacto Ecosocial del Sur, which is an attempt to formulate a shared horizon for a wide range of social organizations and social movements to build on their experiences from the past, to move toward a direction that would be sustainable and just, understanding just in very different dimensions, like gender justice, environmental justice, climate justice, but also interethnic justice, the justice that leaves colonial relations behind, class justice, of course, and that tries to not formulate like a policy program, but a direction which marks, I don't know, which orients social and political action in the widest ways. And there is an initiative in Europe, which is called the Blueprint for Europe's Just Transition, which somehow gets into a dialogue with that, because it's also been written by lots of movement representatives and also some people of more political parties, which is, as far as I have seen, the one proposal from Europe that sees the global South in its attempt to find solutions to a just transition for Europe, because the big, like the big political programs, the European Green Deal, for example, from the European Union, just assumes that the global South will be there as a big, how do you say that, where the materials will come from for decarbonizing Europe. And it will be there to dump all the waste, and it will be there to compensate emissions that still will take place in Europe. So we can just pay offsets, and the global South will protect forests so we can still have our emissions. And all this was happening in this new net zero emissions discourse. But the Blueprint for Europe's Just Transition does include one important, even institutionalized dimension of international and intersectional and environmental justice, which I think is interesting. And it does also include a life cycle perspective for technological innovation, taking responsibility for the impacts that this would cause in other parts of the world. And which is very important, I think, and absolutely imprescindible, is that it proposes to get out of the expansionist paradigm and to leave growth behind and to build other forms of well-being in Europe too. So this, we could say, it's like very, very first steps in a conversation where the geopolitical North and the geopolitical South could maybe string some parts together for a transition that actually would be just. I could say many more things, but I think that's enough for now.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the issue of Green New Deal is something that maybe we can also come back in the last question on looking at challenges, because in a way, some of what's coming from within civil society sector also, or what seems to be progressive, some of it is, but some of it might also be problematic, including the Green New Deal in the way it's being currently formulated. So maybe we can come back to that in the last question. I'll just take a quick, just build on what you're saying in terms of existing alternatives or existing initiatives that are already maybe providing to us systemic fundamental solutions or answers. And if I might, since I'm not as articulate as you, I'm going to fall back on using a couple of slides for that. So I think this, if one looks at what you have very rightly said, is that actually from across the world, what we're seeing is both worldviews, theories, and practice, and especially from the global South. And this is something that we really need to be able to recognize, do much more documentation of, much more outreach, many more stories of the kind of incredible things that are happening on the ground and conceptually in terms of worldviews. We obviously don't have time to go into many of these, but I think the two or three that I've been particularly inspired by, because they're also at fairly large scale, are the Kurdish Rojava movement in the midst of the most war-torn part of the world, the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey border, where ecofeminist revolution of kinds trying to create a local direct democracy, confederalist structure, and try and sort of regain once more coexistence with the land and with nature is pretty amazing and inspiring. And the other, of course, is the Zapatista, which I'm sure most people on this call would already know of, but the attempt at creating a completely autonomous region which doesn't even recognize the nation state and is able to show that its people, hundreds of thousands of people, can actually live very well within the limits of nature and by relating to each other in much more equitable ways. But there are many others, including the ones, Miriam, that you mentioned: the commons, the eco-feminists, the transition movements, etc. I guess none of them are perfect, but they all show to us the possibilities of a very fundamental transformation. And what we've done, one of the things we've kind of worked on in India is to look at what are the main sort of broad pathways that are emerging from this. And this is a flower of transformation that has emerged from that exercise. And what we see here is transformations taking place in 5 obviously interlinked, like you said, intersectional ways, spheres of life. The politics, which is where people are asserting that we will be part of decision making. We're not going to leave it only to politicians and bureaucrats and all of that, but also that we will assert more and more a bioregional sense of political governance also, not necessarily accepting the current nation states, but saying, look, if a river has been cut through by a national boundary, we have to re-examine that boundary itself, because it is creating ecological and cultural problems. Then there is the assertion of economic sovereignty at the local level, at least in terms of basic needs. And like you said very rightly, bringing back the relationships of caring and sharing, rather than thinking of the economy only in terms of money and profits. The struggles for gender justice, against casteism in India, for equality of various kinds, etc., the social part of it. Then there's the cultural and knowledge diversity part, which again we've been emphasizing through the examples, that it's not just modern science and technology, but multiple different kinds of knowledges. It's not just Western culture, if there is something like that, but multiple different cultures, languages, food systems, ways of knowing, ways of being, ways of doing, which are crucial to these transformations. And then, of course, at the base of all of this is the ecological systems that without which we'll all be dead anyway. So I think maybe some of what's emerging from these grounded initiatives is multiple different ways of looking at how the world is being transformed, can be transformed. Of course, we have to recognize that a lot of this is still marginal. The dominant systems is still able to suppress a lot of these, but it's like, as we're seeing collapse happening around us, it's these saplings and seedlings which are so important for us to nourish, because ultimately they're the ones who will grow up into becoming trees or coral reefs or whatever, which will hopefully replace the currently completely flawed system. So I wanted to add that also. We, of course, we can go, I think Miriam and I can go on for hours talking about examples of incredible examples of alternatives on the ground, but that may be for another time. Should we get to the last question, or the last two, I think, which we can probably combine, which is, what are the main challenges that we face in trying to bring about these kinds of systemic fundamental transformations? Miriam, you want to go first, or should I?
As you wish, you can go.
Okay, I'm going to be quick about this, because I think we also wanted to leave about half an hour or so for others to jump in. Yeah, okay. So very quickly, I mean, we're all familiar with this. Obviously, one of the most important challenges is the sheer power of the currently dominant system. And by that, one could talk about capitalism and corporations, especially in our lives. One could talk about statism or the powers of nation states, especially authoritarian nation states, patriarchy, or many different forms of patriarchy that still exist, racism in India, casteism, and many other such isms. But also, I think the mindset of human beings dominating the earth, which you started off with, Miriam, and this the way, the two ways of looking at us. One is this so-called pyramid of life, in which human beings are right on top, and the other is a circle in which we are just one out of millions of species. And so I think it's really this entrenched system which is obviously going to be one of the biggest challenges. But in this, what I find particularly complex to deal with is that it's not just the presidents of the world and the CEOs of the corporations. it's actually hundreds of millions of people who have been, including all of us in some ways, brainwashed into thinking that this is the only direction we can go. The only way for human progress is more and more and more material consumption, more and more energy guzzling lifestyles. And so you can go to the furthest, remotest, I don't like the word remote because, it assumes that there's a center and then that villages are remote from that center. But anyway, you can go to villages which have hardly ever been touched by so-called development. And if you ask them, okay, well, what is it that you're aspiring for? It's the same stories. We want a big road, we want a hospital, we want this, we want. And so it's not their fault. I mean, this is basically what the system has done. It's brainwashed all of us into basically dreaming the dreams of our oppressors. So that, to my mind, is a huge challenge also. How do we get ourselves away and out of that kind of thing? Third is the false solutions. We've just finished COP26, and we see that everybody's clapping about the fact that some countries have committed to net zero by 2050, some by 2060, India by 2070, and everybody's like applauding this. But we know that this is fraud. It's an absolute fraud. This net zero thing is just a complete greenwash. Firstly, because it's talking about technologies which don't even exist right now, which will supposedly capture all the carbon from the air. It's talking about massive levels of plantations, which are probably where is the land, and where the land is, it's going to displace communities even more. And it's not talking about the fact that we have to actually stop the emissions in the first place. Why let them continue going on and then capture it somewhere else? And so these market based solutions, techno fixes, managerial solutions are just ways of diverting our attention. And unfortunately, a lot of civil society also actually falls for that. And so we have to be able to challenge that, and including, as we were talking about the Green New Deal, like you rightly said. So for instance, Bernie Sanders, whose Green New Deal I think is extremely progressive compared to the rest of what's coming from mainstream politicians in the US, nevertheless falls into the trap of saying that instead of fossil fuel cars, everybody in America will have electric cars, not realizing or not wanting to realize that that's going to mean enormous amounts of mining somewhere on the planet, which is probably going to be in Africa or Latin America or somewhere else, rather than saying that we will replace all private cars by public transport and cycling and walking. We're saying, okay, just do away with fossil fuel and just bring in electric cars. And that's just one example of a limited mindset with the Green New Deal. And lastly, I think the challenge is fragmentation of our own movements. We still have not been able to, I think we're getting better, but we still haven't really been able to bring, build a global movement. The World Social Forum did quite a lot, but it's been faltering. We need to, bring it back and then create more things amongst ourselves, to be able to put the resistance movements and the alternatives movements together and see how we can actually truly become a global mass to affect that kind of, to challenge and affect the kind of macro changes that we want. So I would put that also as another big challenge. Miriam, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think you have named lots of them. I would just add very few, because I also would like to leave at least half an hour for a dialogue with all of you and not cope all the time space between the two of us. So I would add the huge challenge of the rise of the extreme right and different kinds of authoritarianism in different parts of the world. We are just seeing that even in Chile, where there has been so much mobilization in the last years, massive uprisings of young people, now a right-wing, extreme right-wing candidate might win the next elections and reframe completely what all those people had managed to get to, which is a new constitutional assembly where they were supposedly discussing a new legal foundation for their future. We have the same in Argentina. We have a right rising in Peru, where also supposedly there was now a left-wing government, peasant-led, which was trying to implement some changes. We have it in Colombia all the time. I think India is not an exception. And there is, within this brainwashing that you mentioned, Ashish, I think there is also this deep sense of insecurity in this world that changes so much and presents so many threats to life, that one of the possible reactions is just to say, okay, I give up my responsibility for my own life. I want somebody to be in charge and to protect me. And this is this huge backlash of patriarchalism, which brings to the front people like Bolsonaro or like Trump or like even Modi, where people somehow surrender. And I think this is a very important cultural battle that we have to fight for emancipation, to bring emancipation back in, and what it means in sort of gaining quality of life and well-being, how it feels to get rid of domination, not to surrender to domination. And and there is also a challenge that puzzles me increasingly, and it's the challenge posed to political participation and organization of people by increasing consumer debt, like people that are coerced into the banking system, into having credit cards and then spend too much, and then their own concern, their main concern is how to pay their debt, and this withdraws them from all these interactions that we so urgently need today with others in the rebuilding of our world. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
So should we then open up to questions, comments, additional perspectives that people might want to bring in? Philip, how do you want to do this?
Sure, definitely. I guess before I saw a hand, Herman before already.
Yeah, I would like to react to your question about the rights of nature, Herman, that you stated in writing, if this is fine with you. And then you can, I think you are partially right. The rights of nature is not the solution to a biocentric or ecocentric ontology. It's just one strategy that has been adopted in order to make some space, I think, yeah. But as we see now, as it's being handled, it's like, okay, I'm going to give rights to this river and to this tree and to this, and that was not the intention, yeah. And we are discussing this problem here in Ecuador, for example. It's not about compartmenting nature into subjects that then will have rights versus others that wouldn't, because we of course can't file court suits for all the trees and all the rivers. But yeah, it was I think what it did is shake the grounds of anthropocentrism by questioning the assumption that only humans could have rights. Yeah, but I think the debate is much broader. It's about our perspective on value and go beyond only the exchange value versus use value thing, and understand that things and other beings have intrinsic value, and that we are just a part of a much wider ecosystem, and that life won't exist without community building with this ecosystem. That's how I would maybe put it.
Yeah, I co-authored a legal textbook on Earth Law, Emerging Ecocentric Law, the Practitioner's Guide. I'd be glad to put the title in the chat. So it's a question that really goes beyond what we can cover this morning, but I mean, in that we dealt with various legal theories, including rights of future generations and well, we had a whole catalog, and then did a summary of all the different theories that are being used around the world. So it's just a continuing question for me. I don't know how many of you know Ivan Vargas Roncancio, but he's done some really interesting work in this area that I could send to you, Miriam. I think you'd like it.
Yeah, please. Would be great.
Yeah, Armin, just yeah, please do put that in the chat. We'll all want to take a look at it. Who else? Those of you who want contacts for the World Social Forum International Committee members who I can provide you, just send me an email and I can send you the contacts.
Other comments, questions?
Disagreements also.
Maybe there's been so much in what you've said that maybe it's too much. Jane?
Hi, thank you so much, both of you. It feels like a coming home listening to this dialogue between the two of you. Mine is more I suppose a question to the community, two questions to the community, I think, with two things that I'm grappling with. And the one is really getting to grips around the care economy and linking that with agroecology or food sovereignty. And the reason I'm particularly interested in trying to work this out is, as you can tell from my accent, I'm South African, and I've worked with a lot of local farmers there who are seeing farming as almost like as a political act in itself, as an act to both secure the land from mining. So if we community farm on a land, then the land can't be taken from us. So it's that kind of political act, and then a political act in terms of having the sovereignty to be able to resist, which is what I loved about the comment about resilience or you know, what is resilience? Because actually a real resilience is the ability to resist these forces that are so. And the care economy keeps coming up for us because one of the challenges is as the climate emergency gets stronger, where I've worked up in the north of South Africa, it's getting harder and harder to grow food simply without even shade cloth, and then with women trying to just find some ways in which to address the challenges of sustaining themselves with food without having to end up giving up growing their gardens in order to get employment just to be able to have a garden. Is that, you know, so it's almost those like grounded solutions to problems that are coming up around the climate emergency. And I've got a sense that something around the care economy can help with that, but almost like at what levels can the care economy function so that women in South Africa, in the north of South Africa, can find solutions to this particular problem as it arises on the global stage, I suppose, which then comes to my second passion, and that's what you mentioned, Ashish, about telling the stories. And I just would love, even from anybody here, the examples of how, and in a way that really works with the cognitive justice elements of telling stories. So not appropriation, but in a sense of like, how do we provide those platforms for stories to be told, but not just as anecdotes, but as critical material, I suppose, critical evidence of what we're struggling with. I don't know if that's clear, but those are the two things that came up for me as I listened to your amazing dialogue.
Ashish?
Thanks, Jane. Sorry, you okay? Yeah, no, thanks, Jane. I think both very important comments. I mean, with the care economy and what we're seeing, I think around the world is so many amazing examples of different kinds of the care economy, right? And especially where people are trying to get away from the hegemony of centralized monetary systems. and be able to show that we can actually have economies that don't depend on the rupee or the dollar or the euro or whatever it is, or at least depend much less so. So the same example I gave earlier of the 5,000 Dalit women farmers from South India is an example where, in fact, very little money passes hands, but in those 5,000 families, because they've commonized seeds, they've commonized knowledge, they've commonized, in some cases, even collectivized their lands, et cetera, that they are able to survive, not just survive, but thrive with very little rainfall, completely organic, etc. And that's why they were, in fact, much better off during the COVID pandemic than many others. But that they also cared for others who were not so, who were not so lucky, or who had actually not been able to create these kinds of systems or recreate these systems, by sharing their food with others who were going hungry. And that really is the hallmark of the care economy, right? That you're looking at the other, you're being responsible towards, even as you assert rights, you're also being responsible towards the others. So whether it's the gift economy, whether it's in the industrialized countries, it's coming back as time banking or alternative local community currencies, many different forms of this, of the social and solidarity economy, etc., or Graham and Gibson and their work on community economies, etc. So there's a lot out there which I think we can learn from. In terms of stories, one of the things that the GTA did in the last 1.5 years, because we couldn't physically meet, in a way it was almost a blessing in disguise, because we were able to provide a global platform through webinars for local community stories to come out. So I think, Franco, if you're still there, maybe you can put into the chat the link to the webinar series. I think there are about 20 of them from different parts of the world, of communities who have shown all of these sorts of alternatives and solutions throughout the crisis period. But not just COVID, but also other kinds of crises. And I think it's these stories coming from the communities themselves, from the people who are within the communities or who are working with these communities, which are so much more powerful than if I was to go and write an article on them. And I think we need to do much more of that. We don't do enough of it. We need to do much more that, where those of us who are privileged enough to be on a laptop and a call like this, are enabling those voices to come out in local, national, global forums much more than is otherwise happening. People are technologically challenged. People don't necessarily have access of the kind that we have. There are millions of people who don't read and write, but that doesn't mean they're not experts. They're all experts in their own sense. And how do those voices come in? And we're actually, in fact, even challenging universities. They're saying, why should only PhDs be the ones to teach students? Why not a indigenous person from a forest in central India who can tell you 300 species of plants without being able to write them out, but they know them in their head, right? Local name, etc., and all their uses. So even just challenging pedagogies, challenging academic structures to be able to bring community voices much more into all of this. I think that is the kind of thing that we should do much more. And stories in different forms. Yeah, thanks. Miriam?
Okay, yeah, Jane, I would like to relate to what you said about farming as a political act. I am actually a bit worried that the importance of our agri-food system, both in destructing the planet and in the possibilities of saving it, are not taken seriously enough. Like in the whole COP26 in Glasgow, even if there was a sort of methane agreement, it didn't talk about agriculture. Yeah, it's like kept out as if it was on purpose. And we have this oligopolic structure of the 4 mega corporations who own the global food production system. And I think actually we should push very much stronger for agroecology as both a solution to food sovereignty, hunger, poverty, and to climate change. because, well, as you might know, there are those calculations from organizations like GRAIN that say that not only approximately 1/3, as the IPCC says, but almost half of greenhouse gas emissions, if you count in both the transport of food in this absurdly globalized world and the waste that is generated by the agri-food system through packaging and in retail, etc., is accountable for almost half of the emissions. So if we would start with that, it would maybe tackle a whole range of problems like inequality and that all the time, at the same time. But this again needs a very different approach to property systems, the right to private property and collective property and land as such. And yeah, the other thing about education, I think, education should be rebuilt from the ground also. Like, instead of being an education that teaches children prefabricated answers or students, it should be an education that teaches to ask the right questions and then to investigate on one's own and to find paths. And I very much agree with Ashish, and we try to do that to some extent in my master's, for example, that it's absolutely crucial to bring other knowledges in, to bring other voices in, not to speak about them, but to listen to them and interact directly. So bringing the students out of the universities into communities is one thing, and bringing community representatives as experts into the university circuits is another one, in very simple terms.
So anyone else?
Yeah. Anish.
Yeah, sure, Anish.
Hello, Ashish and Miriam. I really like the session. And okay, can you hear me first of all? Okay. So my question was about. So my current research interests or whatever are linked to the changes we see in our aesthetics due to climate change occurring. And one such instance to describe this interest would be like the examples we use to understand phenomena, etc., might change because those examples itself are changing. And I was just wondering, when we think of so-called marginalized communities, if there are these distinct changes that we see emerging due to climate change in their lives that might affect how the community evolves, in the sense that, say, if a wooden matka or a clay pot, which was always used, gradually starts getting replaced by what we think of as better products, though that's not the case, but it might start to occur because of different goods flowing in, different networks operating, etc., etc. Now, the analogies and the stories that evolve around a matka might end up also changing, and these are stories that one grows up with. So I was just wondering that as you spend time with different networks and different communities, if you see some aesthetic changes occurring that have manifold implications. And I ask this to better incorporate this into my thinking and but very different, and so I couldn't relate it much better to the larger theme of the conference or like of the session.
Yeah, no, well, it does. I think, Miriam, if I can just take a minute and then, you can also respond. It does. I mean, so you've given the example of the pot, but let's take the example of construction of buildings. We are seeing certainly all over India in the so-called, again, quote unquote, remotest villages, probably all over the world, the replacement of what were to a large extent, very sustainable construction and buildings and settlement processes and technologies, their replacement by cement and concrete, including in areas where it just makes absolutely no climatic sense at all. I mean, because then it's really hot in the summer and it's really cold in the winter. Whereas in fact, when they had either rock or mud or wood or whatever the local materials were, they were also in that sense resilient to the weathers, much more able to cope with that. This is coming not because they necessarily feel that this new thing is going to last longer, but because it's happening everywhere and this is higher status. So it's an aesthetic thing, it's a social status thing, it's many different things. So I think this is where, again, it's that whole mindset thing, which we are all in some sense kind of subjected to. That what is, let's take food. People who were eating lots of diverse kinds of foods, like what we call millets or so-called coarse grains. The term coarse grains itself is insulting, but let's say millets or red rice or black rice or whatever. In came the British and said, oh, this is all backward stuff. You need to eat white rice and you need to eat the polished wheat. And unfortunately, post-independence in India, that's still been pushed. So I can go to a village in India where they themselves might, because they're poor, they themselves might be eating their local things. But as a guest, they will actually give me, they'll try and pull out some white rice and give it to me. So it's also aesthetics. It's all sorts of different things. There's a whole agroeconomic system that actually is pushing this, which is trying to say that this is what should be eaten and not this. And young kids in school are growing up with these kinds of things. Going back to Steve's question about the education system, what are we learning in school? We're learning in school that what our own parents were growing was backward, primitive, and in fact we should be eating what people in cities, rich people in cities are eating. So which is actually also ironical, because rich people in cities are actually turning back to some of those traditional crops and buying them at enormous prices. Anyway, so yeah, there's a whole bunch of this kind of transformations taking place, and we have to figure out how we can again bring in processes by which mindsets again can be changed to be much more respectful of diversity, of ecologies, of food sovereignty, of respectful of farmers who are putting food on our plates, and so much else. Miriam, a comment from you?
No, nothing to add. I totally agree with what you said. Zaina, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just I know that we are running out of time, but it's been such an interesting conversation. I think the one takeaway, I mean, from the way we moved from one topic to another into the conversation is the fact that how interconnected all these silos are, and the way the silos have been made itself in a kind of elite knowledge economy, that agriculture is separate, environment studies are separate, finance is separate, construction, architecture, all of that is separate, but in a way how this all kind of connects. So my question really again is very fundamental in terms of the reasons why these silos exist, and the way as a society we value certain things over other things, that I mean a particular kind of degree in a particular kind of knowledge system has more value, therefore it's more expensive vis-a-vis the knowledge that you would find in common pools in rural areas and so on. So do you think, I mean, the way I think Ashish touched on the fact on community currencies and so on, and how we can change these, like what we value in a way. And do you think the kind of revolution that we've seen in the last few years in digital currencies or cryptocurrencies, and how there's this kind of like outside the nation state's monetary systems, currencies kind of evolving everywhere through digital platforms. So again, in your work or in the future, do you suspect that that cryptocurrencies is one way of revaluing certain things that the mainstream does not value, and whether we reach a system where every village or community will have their own like coin that takes into account things that environmentally or socially should be valued? I don't know if that was very clear for anyone who wants to.
Okay, it's a difficult question. I think that at least the way cryptocurrencies are being used now is not very promising, because they're mainly used for speculation and getting people rich without, it's like a new rent mechanism, yeah, which makes the rentier logic stronger and not the logic of caring for life, for example. But this, and the other big problem that I see with cryptocurrencies is that the blockchain, the computer-based blockchain technology needs a huge amount of energy and hardware, so it's also not sustainable necessarily, yeah. Which doesn't exclude that we couldn't look into maybe, I don't know, creating currencies with another purpose, like creating currencies for the caring of life, yeah. But that would have to be in another institutional setting, let's say, which still would have to be created and not in this non-regulated, semi-illegal space of cryptocurrencies now, which is also fueling very much all the narco economy, the very violent aspects of capitalism in the shadows, which we wouldn't like to strengthen, right? I think community currencies are a whole different issue. They don't need energy, and they're based on relations and enhanced relations. Also, all the time banking stuff that Ashish mentioned, like how can we take out some dimensions and aspects of our everyday lives and of our everyday needs of capitalist circuits and the circuits of profit, and give them another purpose. That, and I think money is an important issue, but I'm not so deep into that. Yeah. So I would, for now, stick to the community currencies at different levels, maybe, like having community currencies at the very local and then at the municipal or at the regionals, like in order to be able to build up some sort of scaled self-sufficiency levels that interact with each other and allow for relative deglobalization. That's a vision that I could share. Don't know you, Ashish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're over time, so just a minute on this. I think one of the biggest challenges that community currencies face is precisely the interactability. So does the Bristol pound manage to interact with the Beki in Luxembourg, with some other currency in Nairobi in Kenya, for instance? How does that work? Without having to go through the euro, dollar, etc. exchange rates. So that's one of the puzzles that a lot of people are working on. How does one make the community currencies remain local? They're controlled locally. They're extremely decentralized and democratic in that sense, many of them. But then if I go with my community currency to some other part of the country or another part of the world, I can't use that. So then how does that work? That's something that's the puzzle piece of the part of the puzzle that has to be figured out. And as far as digital currencies are concerned, take a look at Faircoin and Fairbank. One of our colleagues, in fact, has been trying to pioneer this in different parts of Europe, which tries to avoid the kinds of problems that Miriam spoke about with cryptocurrencies, much more democratically controlled, much less ecologically intense, etc. So to take a look, I don't know very much about it either, but these seem to be some of the promising leads.
Great.
Thanks.
Any final questions, comments? Some people have already said thank you and left, so I suppose. Okay, if that's not the case, do you both have final closing points you want to make?
No, not really. I would just like to thank for this kind of spaces. I think creating these kinds of spaces is what brings us forward to, yeah, intercontinental, intercultural dialogues where people can contribute from their own experiences. So thanks to you, Zainab and Philip, for organizing this and for having us here. Thanks to you, Ashish, for meeting again. And yeah, I hope it has been useful for some of you.
Okay, various people who left before sent individual messages to say it's been great. So even some messages you won't see in the public chats. I don't know why they send me individual messages, but never mind.
Well, same here. Thanks to all of you for organizing this. Miriam, it's always great to have this kind of a dialogue with you. So thank you. And maybe some of these specific issues that people have asked, like the whole issue of community currencies and digital currencies, or the issue of the alternative learning in education spaces or others, could be part of more detailed conversation, specific topics that we take up for more detailed conversation, bringing in also some other people who are good at those topics as a future step. Thank you.
Good idea. Thanks.
Okay, fine. Then thank you very much to both of you coming. And one thing I forgot to do at the beginning, thank you to Zainab for organizing in the first place. And thank you to all of you for joining. And okay, have a good day, good evening, depending on where you are around the globe. Bye.
Take care.
Bye. 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 Bye.